She cut off a woman's limbs, gouged out her eyes, and threw her into a pig pen. She poisoned the emperor's son, slaughtered royal bloodlines, and ruled behind silk like a shadow. She wasn't just China's first empress dowager, she was its first butcher. And when she died, her clan was erased, her name whispered in fear. This is the true face of Lü Zhi, not mother, not ruler, executioner. She was not born into silk. Lü Zhi came into the world around 241 BC, in a modest village called Shanfu, far from the lacquered halls of power, far from the blood-stained palaces she would one day command. Her father was no nobleman. He was a magistrate, literate, firm, and feared in his province. From him she inherited more than a surname. She inherited discipline, calculation, and a silence that watched everything. In a time when women were barely taught to write their names, Lü Zhi could read bamboo slips by candlelight. She read legal cases, she studied the faults of men. She watched how punishment worked. She watched how it didn't. And above all, she watched who survived. She did not dream of love, she dreamed of position. So when a rough, loud-talking soldier named Liu Bang came into her father's court, brash, clever, and half drunk, she did not flinch. He was beneath her. But he was rising, that was all that mattered. They married not for love, but for momentum. She saw in him not a man, but a future. And when he rebelled against the collapsing Qin dynasty, she followed. Not behind, not beside, just far enough to be forgotten in the mud, but close enough to reappear when the war ended. She crossed mountains with him, slept in barns, fled assassins, stole food from dead soldiers. Her hands bled from the same blades that crowned emperors. And still she did not break. Liu Bang fought like a peasant. Lü Zhi endured like a ghost. The war was long. Jiang Yu, the rival warlord, was stronger, richer, more noble. But Liu Bang had what Jiang Yu lacked, cunning allies. And one of those allies, though hidden under layers of silk and silence, was Lü Zhi herself. She was not a warrior, she was a survivalist. She studied alliances, not armies. She remembered insults. She paid favours not with gold, but with futures. By the time Liu Bang marched into Xianyang and declared himself the first emperor of the Han dynasty, Lü Zhi had already begun writing her own script. She had seen what happened to women who waited. She would not wait. As Liu Bang bathed in victory, took new concubines, and renamed cities after himself, Lü Zhi prepared her own tools, not weapons, not soldiers, but eyes, secrets, leverage. She was not a woman who demanded power. She was a woman who gathered it like dust, quiet, invisible, and inescapable. In the early court, she was dutiful, humble, polite. She bowed where expected. She smiled in measured silence. But behind her curtain of obedience was a ledger, a tally of names, a growing map of allies, and a list of those who would not live to see her fully rise. The nobles thought her docile, the ministers called her wise, but Lü Zhi had no use for their praise. She only cared for one thing, keeping her son alive. Liu Ying, the son she bore Liu Bang, was a gentle boy. Too gentle. He lacked the hunger of empire, the rage of inheritance. And worse, his father, already distracted by war and women, was growing cold toward him. When Lady Qi, the favoured concubine, bore the emperor another son, Rui, clever and charming, Lü Zhi understood immediately what was at stake. The crown, her bloodline, everything. She had crawled through ash and war to reach the palace. She would not be erased by a woman who hadn't shed blood. From this moment on, Lü Zhi ceased to be wife or consort. She became something else, a force, an observer no longer. And in that silence, in that stillness beneath silk, a storm began to take shape, one made not of thunder, but of knives. Because the farmer's daughter had learned one thing above all: you don't need to swing the blade, only to own the hand that does. Liu Bang had won the empire, but he lost interest in his empress. The throne was built from broken blades and betrayals, and Liu Bang, now Emperor Gaozu, took to it like a gambler to wine. The palace expanded, the court swelled. And in the shadows of war he found her, Lady Qi. She was younger. She was clever. She sang, she laughed. And most dangerously of all, she bore him a son. His name was Rui, a boy with bright eyes, a sharp tongue, and a father's undivided affection. Liu Bang adored him, cradled him in court, paraded him before generals. Whispers began to fill the halls. This is the true prince. Liu Ying is too quiet. Rui is the emperor's favourite. Lü Zhi did not argue. She bowed, she smiled, and silently she unravelled. In public she remained the Empress, regal, poised, unshaken. She held audiences, honoured ancestors, poured tea at ceremonies beside her husband. But inside her chest something coiled. Not grief, not jealousy, instinct. She had buried too many corpses to let another woman rewrite her son's future. She knew how emperors thought. She had watched Liu Bang abandon allies, forget promises, execute childhood friends. If he could kill for convenience, he could discard a son just as easily. So she waited. She memorized every move Lady Qi made, what music she favoured, what servants she trusted, where she walked when the moon was highest. Lü Zhi never touched her, never spoke ill of her. She simply began planting seeds. A compliment here, a suggestion there. A favour quietly returned. Ministers began to question Ru Yi's place. Generals expressed doubt. The boy, they said, was soft, too pretty, too clever. And Liu Ying? Well, he was born of a lawful wife. The law mattered, until it didn't. Liu Bang grew ill. The wars had taken his strength and time had hollowed his bones. He coughed blood, forgot names, and with every passing day Lü Zhi moved a little closer to his chamber, and to control. She did not fight for her son. She fought because without power they would both die. In court, Liu Bang began drafting edicts. He spoke of succession, of military strategy, of retiring from state affairs, and one day, perhaps without fully understanding the weight of his words, he spoke aloud what no one had dared confirm. Perhaps Ru Yi should be heir. Silence. Sharp. Immediate. Lü Zhi said nothing. But that night, the paper bearing that thought vanished, burned in a brazier. The scribe who transcribed it, reassigned, quietly, forever. Even the walls of the palace began to turn toward Lü Zhi. She wasn't charming like Lady Qi, she was inevitable. As Liu Bang's health declined, Lü Zhi began to construct her own government, one without titles but full of loyalty. She married her son to political allies, promoted eunuchs who owed her everything, whispered to generals who feared disorder more than they feared her, and still she siled. Ru Yi grew older. His presence in court became less frequent, his visits watched. Lady Qi began to worry, but it was too late. The web had already tightened. Liu Bang died in 195 BC. Officially it was illness. In truth it was timing. Before his body was even cold, Lü Zhi ensured the court recognized Liu Ying as Emperor Hui. Her son was now the ruler of the Han dynasty. But power is not inherited. It is claimed. And though her son wore the crown, it was Lü Zhi who held the reins. As for Lady Qi, she still breathed, but not for long, because in the eyes of Empress Lü, a threat not buried is a throne not secured, and thrones are only safe when their rivals no longer cast shadows. Liu Bang was dying, and Lü Zhi began to feed, not on flesh, not on blood, but on silence, absence, and fear. She had no army, she had no sword, but she had presence, she had patience, and now she had proximity. As the Emperor's cough grew wetter, and his memory grew dim, Lü Zhi tightened the net she had spent years weaving. She chose the guards posted outside his chamber. She screened the letters sent to his generals. She limited which wives were allowed to visit, and when they did, they were watched. Always watched. No one stopped her. They feared disorder more than they feared her, and so she spread, quiet as mildew, steady as winter. Lady Qi was still in the palace, still cherished in the Emperor's failing moments. She brought him soups, whispered poetry, soothed his fits. But love does not guarantee safety, and favour cannot withstand inevitability. Lü Zhi played no open games. She merely repositioned the board. She assigned eunuchs loyal only to her to the inner court. She recalled ministers from the border and replaced them with younger men who owed her everything. She arranged marriages for her son that created new bonds across noble houses, thick ropes of allegiance that would not snap. Even generals, those mighty killers of kings, began to kneel more deeply before her. She was not warm, she was not cruel, she was necessary. One day, as Liu Bang lay coughing blood into a bronze basin, Lü Zhi handed him a list. Promotions, titles, rewards for the faithful service. He signed without reading. His hand trembled, and with that stroke he gave her command over nearly every lever of state. Some say he understood what she had done. that in his final days he began to fear her more than he feared death, that he ordered Ru Yi, the son of Lady Qi, to be taken away, hidden from her reach, that he whispered to a guard captain, a man still loyal to Qi's line, protect the boy at all cost. But it was too late. Lü Zhi already knew. She had ears in the walls, names on every scroll, and loyalists who carried out her wishes without ever needing to hear them spoken. She did not need to confront the emperor. She did not need to confess. She only needed to wait. He would die, and when he did, she would erase every trace of doubt he had left behind. When Liu Bang finally exhaled his last breath in the winter of 195 BC, the court erupted into orchestrated grief. Drums sounded, courtiers wept, his body was wrapped in silks and incense smoke. But Lü Zhi did not mourn. She managed. She ensured the heir, Liu Ying, was crowned quickly. Before any rival had time to gather their breath, she issued edicts in her son's name. She oversaw the transition of guards, the sealing of archives, the appointment of ministers. The palace did not stagger. It did not tremble. It simply bent. To her. Lady Qi was placed under honourable confinement. Prince Ru Yi was summoned to the capital. The trap was nearly closed, and Lü Zhi, for the first time, was no longer just an empress. She was something else, not dowager, not co-ruler. She was the voice behind every decree, the shadow behind every decision, the unblinking eye at the heart of the empire. And yet she remained soft-spoken. She did not raise her voice. She did not claim credit. She sat behind a curtain of golden threads, face calm, fingers folded. But the wind no longer moved in the emperor's name. It moved in hers, because when the emperor fell, the dragon throne did not stand empty. It whispered, and the whisper wore red silk. He was still a child when he died. Prince Ru Yi, son of Emperor Gaozu and Lady Qi, entered the capital with a smile and a letter in his hands, written by his late father, sealed in red wax. It was said to be an imperial edict of protection, a final act of love. It meant nothing. The moment Ru Yi crossed into the palace gates, the world had already decided his fate. He was not a prince, he was a liability, and Empress Lü Zhi did not make room for liabilities. She greeted him at the gates herself, not with venom, not with scorn, but with maternal warmth. A perfumed sleeve, a careful smile, the perfect performance of a grieving stepmother welcoming her late husband's son. The boy bowed. He trusted her, and Lü Zhi said nothing. No accusations, no threats, just silence, and then a feast. She fed him gently, walked him through the garden, placed her hand on his shoulder as they passed the stone dragon, told him stories of his father's battles, and all the while she was calculating the hour, measuring the dosage, watching the guards. When the wine was poured, she nodded, just once. And somewhere behind the paper walls, a servant understood. There are many accounts of how Ru Yi died. Some say he drank poisoned tea. Others claim he was slowly starved in a sealed room, the guards forbidden to open the doors even as his cries echoed down the marble halls. Some say he died peacefully, unaware. Others say he begged for his mother. We will never know which is true, because those who saw the truth never lived to write it. What we do know is this: the boy who might have been emperor was never seen again, and the empress, Lü Zhi, never spoke his name again. Lady Qi did not yet know. She was still confined in a separate wing of the palace, believing her son to be safe, still writing him poems, still sending folded birds made of silk to be slipped under the lattice. But the messages were never delivered. The birds were never opened. They collected in a dusty box beside a eunuch's sleeping mat, yellowing with time and grief. By the time whispers of Ru Yi's death began to stir through the corridors, it was too late for her to act, and even if she could have screamed, no one would have heard her, because the boy was gone, and without him, Lady Qi had no power, no protection, no future. She had been spared the blade, but what came next would make death seem like mercy. For Lü Zhi, this was not murder. It was insurance. She had erased the heir, removed the rival, closed the chapter Liu Bang had foolishly tried to keep open. And as the official mourning period continued for the late emperor, as the court wept and scribes chiselled his achievements into stone, Lü Zhi sat behind her curtain of gold silk and began to plan her next move. No banners were raised, no soldiers marched. But war had begun again, this time not with swords or fire, but with poison, silence, and ritual. The Han court did not notice at first. They thought the empire was healing, that the empress was grieving, that the new emperor, Liu Ying, would now rule in peace. But those who watched closely saw something shift. The boy on the throne was pale, uncertain, controlled, and the woman behind the veil, she had tasted blood, and found it useful, because now, with Rui gone and Lady Qi alone, there was only one piece left to remove, and Lü Zhi had always preferred her victories to be complete. There was no trial, no charge was read, no defence was permitted, no decree was ever signed. Because this punishment belonged not to the laws of Han, but to Lü Zhi's private vocabulary of cruelty. Lady Qi, once the most beloved concubine of Emperor Gaozu, once praised for her beauty and grace, was dragged from her wing in the dead of night. She was not dressed, she was not warned, she was taken, and no one stopped them. The guards were silent. The halls were empty, and the candles blown out before her screams could reach them. They brought her to a cellar beneath the rear court, a place where wine had once aged. But now it stored something far stronger: vengeance. Lü Zhi watched. She did not shout, she did not strike, she gave one command and the rest unfolded like a ritual that had been practiced before, though never written, never spoken, and never meant to be remembered. First, the limbs. Her arms were bound and severed below the elbow, her legs crushed at the knees, then her eyes, then her ears, then her tongue. Piece by piece she was unmade, not killed, never killed, because death would have ended the lesson too soon. They wrapped her in soiled rags and carried her, bleeding, sightless, mute, to the animal pens behind the palace kitchens. There, among the squeals of swine and the stench of rot, they lowered her into a narrow pen, too narrow to stand, too wide to rest. She was fed with a ladle, not food, slop, and every day the Empress came to watch. Not long, not always, but enough. Enough to see the flies, enough to hear the breathing, enough to remember that silence, when made absolute, does not bring peace, it brings madness. She named her, not Qi, not concubine, but Ren Ji, the human pig. And she made sure the name echoed. Servants were ordered to speak it in whispers. Eunuchs used it behind their fans. Ministers heard it in court but dared not question its origin. It became a myth even before it became a memory. And yet, it was real. One day, Emperor Hui, Lü Zhi's own son, wandered into the wrong corridor, a path he was not meant to take, a door left slightly ajar, a curiosity not yet crushed by protocol. He stepped inside, he saw her, and he vomited. The stench, the shape, the sounds, the recognition, the horror. He ran back to his mother, trembling, pale, unable to speak. And Lü Zhi? She smiled. When he cried, "This is not my palace, this is hell," she answered, not with comfort, but with indifference. Because hell for Lü Zhi was not a place of punishment. It was a place of order. It was a place where threats were neutralized not by exile, but by example. Lady Qi had been erased. Her son was gone, her name blackened, her body mutilated, but her suffering, that was curated, displayed, preserved, a monument to disobedience. Some say Lady Qi survived for weeks, others claim it was months. A few accounts dare to whisper that she lingered even into the second year of Hui's reign. But none can confirm, because no record was ever made, no tomb was ever marked, no rites were ever given. She died as she lived in those final days, nameless, faceless, reduced. Not a person, not even an enemy, just a warning. And through it all, Lü Zhi remained untouched. She continued issuing edicts, blessing marriages, hosting court, a widow in mourning cloaked in ceremonial grace, but beneath the silk, the blood never truly dried. He wore the crown, but she gave the orders. After the death of Prince Rui and the mutilation of Lady Qi, the palace entered a new phase of stillness, one that had nothing to do with peace. It was the stillness of control. Emperor Hui sat on the throne, yes. He signed decrees, nodded in ceremonies, greeted envoys with trembling hands and vacant eyes, but his soul had been broken the day he stepped into the pen and saw what his mother had done, and no one, no advisor, no servant, no god, could piece him back together again. He stopped speaking unless spoken to. He stopped smiling. He stopped questioning. He drank. Then he drank more, and when that failed he withdrew, into chambers so silent they seemed tombs, into meals served behind sealed doors, into the numbness that comes only when power is present but entirely out of reach. The empire, meanwhile, did not halt, because Lü Zhi made sure it moved. She issued edicts in the name of her son, she appointed officials, she removed generals, she judged lawsuits, she revised taxes, she arranged marriages not to create families, but to manufacture loyalty. She sat behind a curtain of woven gold threads, visible to none, yet felt by all. Courtiers called her Empress Dowager, but the words meant nothing. She did not advise. She ruled, and the court knew it. Her relatives began to fill key roles. Nephews were placed in command of the capital guard, cousins were handed border provinces, nieces married into old families, turning ancestral honour into fresh currency. The Lü clan became a second spine in the Han dynasty, one stronger than the first. Those who whispered about the fate of Lady Qi did not whisper twice. Those who questioned the Empress's growing reach found their titles stripped, their land seized, their names scrubbed from ancestral registers. No rebellion rose, no petition arrived, because fear is faster than courage, and Lü Zhi had mastered fear. Even her own son, the emperor in name, grew to dread her presence. When she entered, he stood. When she spoke, he listened. When she asked, he nodded. But in his eyes, there was no affection, only distance. Some say he begged to abdicate, that he once tried to flee the palace disguised as a monk, that he spoke to the stars at night, asking whether emperors could simply disappear. Others claim he died of illness, but many believe something darker, that Lü Zhi, seeing her own son drifting into instability, decided to act. That poison, quiet, efficient, untraceable, entered his cup one morning and silenced him before his madness embarrassed her rule. No historian can say with certainty. The official record claims Emperor Hui died of declining strength, but strength does not vanish in a day, and strength does not fear its mother. Still disputed. What is not disputed is this. After his death, no true heir was installed. Instead, Lü Zhi placed a child on the throne, a distant relative, too young to understand ceremony, too innocent to question why he had become emperor overnight. And just like that, the empire belonged to her, entirely. The throne was a vessel, the emperor a silhouette. Lü Zhi, unseen but omnipresent, was the state. She wrote laws in a hand no one dared imitate. She sealed letters with a stamp carved in her father's name. She listened behind folding screens, and her enemies, sensing her breath on their necks, stopped moving. Not because they were dead, but because they had learned living under Lü Zhi meant dying slowly. The emperor was a child, the throne a stage, the dynasty a performance, but the power was real. After the death of her son Emperor Hui, Lü Zhi wasted no time, no mourning, no delay, no pretense. She selected a successor, not from the bloodline of her husband, but from among the distant branches of the Liu family tree. A boy too young to speak for himself, too docile to resist, too insignificant to matter. A puppet without strings, because the hand controlling him never let go. He was emperor in name. She was empire in practice. The court obeyed, not because they believed in the boy, but because they feared the woman behind the veil. Lü Zhi no longer ruled from behind her son. Now she ruled through shadows, through layers of silk and etiquette, through whispers and paper seals and the illusion of continuity. And around her, the Lü clan rose. Like vines twisting around a dying tree, her family spread across the trunk of the Han court. Nephews commanded armies, cousins administered provinces. In-laws were granted noble titles they had never earned. The Lü became untouchable. They did not serve the empire. They became it. They sat beside generals, they chaired tribunals, they altered verdicts, they reshaped maps. Their names began to appear in poems, in songs, in rumours whispered by travelling merchants who did not dare speak them aloud. And still, Lü Zhi remained in the background. Not absent, but hidden. Not idle, but unchallengeable. She did not claim the title of emperor. She did not need it. The robes of a dowager covered her ambition well. The rituals of mourning concealed her expansion. The distance she maintained from public audiences gave her mythic weight. She was everywhere and nowhere, seen in seals, heard in decisions, felt in the absence of dissent. And yet something cracked beneath the surface. The more she elevated her clan, the more the old nobility began to stir. The Liu family, once rulers now reduced to servants, watched in silence as their rights were stripped. They saw their names erased from appointments, their sons passed over, their influence chipped away by people who shared no blood with the founding emperor. They remembered what Lü Zhi had done to Rui. They remembered the human pig. They said nothing, but they remembered. Among the lower halls, among the chambers where lesser princes dwelled like ghosts of former dynasties, a quiet rage began to rise. It did not speak, it did not strike, it simply waited. Because time, like power, is a tool best used patiently. Lü Zhi, however, did not notice. Or perhaps she believed herself invincible. She had built her government with meticulous cruelty. She had outlived her husband, outmaneuvered Lady Qi, outlived her son. She had installed emperors, bent ministers, and forced history itself to accommodate her name. The Lü clan became not just a faction, but a shadow dynasty. They minted coins. They rewrote court etiquette. They altered ancestral rites to favour their bloodline. And across the capital, statues of dragons once symbolising the Liu imperial house were quietly replaced with new symbols, phoenixes carved in the style of Lü Zhi's personal crest, not in defiance, in reverence, because the empire did not belong to the Han anymore. It belonged to the widow of the warlord. And even though her name was never placed above the throne, and even though her face never appeared on currency, everyone knew. She was no longer merely Empress Dowager. She was the last voice of authority before silence. And every document that crossed her desk carried not just a signature, it carried a warning. She did not die screaming. She died behind silk curtains in a bed lined with incense and gold thread, with loyal servants at her feet and the weight of an empire folded into her final breath. But fear does not grieve, and tyranny leaves no mourners. When Lü Zhi died in 180 BC, the court went silent, not in sorrow but in calculation. The veil of her presence, so long unlifted, had finally fallen, and beneath it a dozen factions stirred like vultures circling a stillborn corpse. Her death was not announced immediately. Too dangerous. The ministers needed time. The princes needed space. The soldiers, those who had sworn their swords to her nephews, needed watching. So for a brief and unnatural pause, the empire held its breath. But nothing held for long. Within days, the coup began. It was not grand. It was not ceremonial. It was surgical. The Liu clan, once scattered and cowed, moved with frightening clarity. They sealed the gates. They summoned the court guard. And before the Lü clan could gather their wits or prepare their pleas, the executions began. No trial, no discussion, only names and blood. Lü Zhi's nephews, once generals, were dragged from their camps and slaughtered on palace stones. Her cousins, who had governed provinces with impunity, were hunted like fugitives and cut down in the streets. Even her in-laws, those married into power, were not spared. They were not killed quietly. They were made examples of, their heads displayed on pikes outside the Hall of Ancestral Light, their limbs nailed to the gates they had once walked through in triumph, their corpses left to rot in the sun as crowds whispered, watched and remembered. The empire devoured the house she built in less than a week, and as if trying to cleanse its own shame, the Han court moved swiftly to erase every trace. Statues carved in her image were smashed, seals bearing her crest were burned, decrees she had signed were reissued under new names. The boy emperor she had installed was deposed, replaced by a prince of purer blood. In public ceremonies, no prayers were offered in her memory. In official scrolls, her name was reduced to a footnote, never outlawed but never celebrated, a shadow on the edge of the page. Even her burial was muted. Though she was placed in a royal tomb beside Emperor Gaozu, no grand procession was held. No eulogies echoed through the court. No monuments bore her likeness. The empress who had ruled behind 3 emperors was buried in stone and forgotten in silence, but her legacy proved harder to erase. She became something else. In the decades that followed, storytellers began to reshape her. She was no longer the widow who held the empire together. She became the spectre who ruled it with blood. In operas, she wore crimson robes and laughed as she turned women into animals. In poems, she whispered to the dead and drank from cups filled with her enemies' tears. And in the darkest corners of the palace, servants swore they could still hear her footsteps, even long after her bones had turned to dust. Because a reign built on silence never truly ends. It echoes. And though her name was stripped from the lips of the court, it survived in shadow, a name not praised, not worshipped, feared. She was not remembered. She was rewritten. In the decades following Lü Zhi's death, China buried more than her body. It buried the memory of her reign beneath layers of numbness, distortion and fear. The scribes of the Han court, those who owed their survival to the Liu clan, had no incentive to praise her, and so they didn't. They dipped their brushes not in truth, but in caution. They recorded her deeds not as policy, but as punishment, not as governance, but as gore. She became a cautionary tale, a symbol, a warning stitched into history's fabric, not for admiration, but for avoidance. And yet, her rule had been real. She had governed with precision, reorganized the court, strengthened imperial control, restored central power after years of rebellion. The state functioned. Roads were repaired. Grain reserves were filled. Justice was carried out, often brutally, but efficiently. For nearly 2 decades she held the realm together, with no civil war, no foreign invasion, no dynastic collapse. But what did it cost? The records do not agree. Some texts call her China's first true tyrant. Others, the most brilliant strategist the Han court had ever seen, most simply avoid her name. They refer to her as the Dowager of Huise, or worse, the mother who ruled. Rarely Empress Lü, never the sovereign. It was not just erasure, it was exile. The historians, men raised on Confucian ideals of obedient wives and moral emperors, had no place for a woman who killed rivals without regret, ruled without permission, and bled the empire without apology. So they pushed her into shadow. They documented her crimes, emphasized her cruelty, amplified the tale of the human pig, recorded the fate of Prince Rui, detailed the bloodbath of the Liu clan, all without context, without political framing, without moral complexity. To them, she was not a ruler. She was a monster. And yet, the people remembered her differently, in whispers, in songs, in the hush that fell when women approached altars with incense sticks and dared wonder aloud. How far must one go to survive? In marketplaces they told stories, sometimes with horror, sometimes with awe. She was not admired, but she was understood, especially by women. In theatre she became the evil empress, a stock character with blood on her hands and a crown carved from stolen bones. In temples she was excluded from ancestral offerings. In poetry she was likened to wolves, serpents, ghosts, but behind the caricature, behind the painted mask, there remained a truth too dangerous to speak aloud, that Lü Zhi had ruled as a man would, but been judged as only a woman could. Her tomb, though still intact, is modest. No towering statues, no gold leaf inscriptions, just carved stone, weathered by centuries of rain and silence. No tourists gather there, no ceremonies are held, yet her shadow remains, in every woman who watched her husband rise, only to be cast aside, in every mother who saw her child's future threatened by a more favoured heir, in every ruler who realised that mercy leaves survivors, and survivors become enemies. She did not write philosophy, she left no poems, she offered no wisdom for posterity, only scars. Scars in the record, scars in the earth, scars in the bloodline she erased to preserve her own, and in the end, even that bloodline died with her. The Han continued. The Liu name endured, but her son, her heirs, they were ground into ash. She left behind no legacy, only questions and silence. Power remembers what history forgets. Lü Zhi never asked to be loved, she asked to survive, and when survival demanded blood, she offered it, slowly, deliberately, without apology. We want to believe tyrants roar, that monsters look like monsters, that cruelty makes itself visible in every gesture. But her hands were steady, her smile practiced, her words few and exact. She did not flinch, she did not hide, she ruled in the open, through curtains and edicts and silence more terrifying than war drums, and the world recoiled not because she was cruel, but because she was effective. When men seize power, we call it strategy. When women do it, we search for madness. When kings kill for dynastic survival, we say they had no choice. When queens kill, we call it personal. But Lü Zhi did what every emperor before and after her would do. She eliminated rivals. She preserved the throne. She ensured the name on the seal matched the blood in her veins. What made her monstrous was that she never pretended to be anything else. She did not wrap her decisions in philosophy. She did not soften her rule with poetry, she did not whisper of compassion. She ruled as history had taught her, through fear. She saw what happened to women who waited. She had no intention of becoming one, and perhaps that is why we struggle to speak her name without flinching. Not because she was so different from the men around her, but because she was exactly the same. Just quieter, just sharper, and just as willing to turn love into leverage. Her story is not a tragedy of innocence lost. It is the anatomy of survival when mercy has no place left to hide. It is the map of a palace carved by knives and guarded by ghosts. It is the price of ruling without pity. So the question lingers, not just for her, but for us. When power becomes total, and pity is carved out of the throne itself, how many must be turned into pigs before we realize the palace is no longer human?